as Anna Freud said, who told you that any of this would be easy? This wasn't supposed to be easy.
Well, let me ask, and obviously the spirit of this show, if there's anything you're comfortable, uncomfortable speaking about, by all means. But as you think about that at the times in which you were contemplating or even trying to commit suicide, that statement you just made, who told you this is supposed to be comfortable? I imagine in that place, that's a very hard, although there's truth to that statement, it's profound. It's very hard to believe that in that moment. How do you, had somebody said that to you in that moment, would you have been able to hear it? And I guess it seems like you hear it now. How did you get to a
Mhm.
place where you did embrace it?
Yeah, no, this is a really good point because no, not only would I have not been able to hear it, I wouldn't have liked it. I would have
Mm,
rejected it. It probably wouldn't have even pierced through the layers of defensive armor that I had built up to get to
mm,
that point.
mm,
Because when you're suicidal or any crisis, and I use any crisis because suicide is one specific version of crisis, but it's not the only one. Um, but when you get to that place, you don't get to that place from nowhere.
mm,
That there's a pathway that gets you there. I wrote about this in my book too. This cognitive pathway that you build to get to that place in your mind, and
mm,
all of the work that goes into getting to that place in your mind. That you learn how to be suicidal, just like you learn anything else from a
mm,
neurological and a psychological perspective. So no, I wouldn't have understood that or heard that at the time, and that I think really speaks to the idea of the gentle progress or the stepwise progress, both into these crises, but
mm,
also out of them as well.
mm,
It's one of the most toxic things I felt as a person living with it, but also then coaching others on their way out too. For one of the most common desires that people have, a noble desire that people have when they're really struggling and depressed, I just want to be happy.
mm,
And then they diminish that down to as though that were easy,
mm,
as though that were
mm,
something that you just get that just everybody else is. Well, let's pull it back and just try to get out of bed this morning.
mm,
Like, so we need to be able to take the steps required to get there instead of projecting way out into the future
mm,
to all these fictionally happy people that we think exist outside of us,
mm,
and actually just do the next right thing, do the
mm,
next best thing for us. And then we realize how far we've come when we look back.
mm. It's really interesting. I'd never thought of it in that way, how you explained it, that it's a lot of work, cognitive work, among other things, to get to a point of being suicidal. You're so right. I think for so many people that haven't experienced it, I haven't never thought of it in that way, but it makes a lot of sense, as you said, to get your mind to that place. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit more about that. And again, it could be any crisis. I understand, right? It's
Mhm.
not just suicide, but is that it's not uncontrollable. I know it's not, right? Because you're articulating the way that you can start to step out of that. But what does that experience feel like? Is it conscious? Do you feel that you're doing that work and heading down that path and you're kind of aware of it? And you feel like, well, it's just the path I have to go down? Or is that almost happening under the covers and you don't realize all that work is being laid out?
I think it's mostly under the covers, but if you look at it, you can see what's happening. If you
Mm,
actually have, and this is why having trained empathetic people from the outside be able to see
mm,
over a period of time what's happening with you. And even still, our healthcare systems, I'm based here in Canada, I'm not sure where you are, but most healthcare systems around the world are not designed in a way that actually really track people in
mm,
that kind of detailed way to watch how their mood is changing, how their behavior is changing, how their environments are changing.
mm,
When I was writing my book, to your question, this is something that I really learned about what that pathway looked like for me because I pulled all of my medical records. I was in and out of hospital more than half a dozen times. I had been on more than a dozen different medications. I had talked to a dozen different doctors. And none of them seemed to really be able to figure out what was wrong with me, why I
mm,
kept getting worse and worse in my mental health. But I took all these medical records over all these years of my childhood and adolescence. I literally laid them out on the floor and on tables. I traced lines between them. I cataloged the dates of when different things happened. Not only my hospitalizations, but when significant things happened at school, when
mm,
things happened at home, when my mom and I had to keep running away to live somewhere else for a couple of days or a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And I plotted all this stuff out and I stood back and looked at it and I thought, wow,
mm,
no wonder.
mm,
No wonder. And why didn't anybody else see this? See how when I would get the help that I needed, I would actually get a bit better. My
mm,
grades would improve. My behaviors would change. I would stop being suicidal. When things got worse, when support was withdrawn, when things were hectic at home, when stuff was stressful at school, then my mental health got worse too. Like it seemed like such an elementary thing that I couldn't understand why anybody didn't see it. So
Why do you think they didn't? I mean, I know there's like a first level why, which is the healthcare system isn't designed
yeah.
for it, but even deeper for yourself, for others, why do you think stuff like that that seems simple when you look at it that way isn't in the moment?
Well, so this brings me back to then the other part of why we don't always see it in ourselves either, because I think this applies to systems levels too. That when you're too close to it, or when you build up enough layers of assumptions, ideas,
Mm,
theories about it, then you reject what's actually happening right in front of you because it's so often you look at people around you and you don't actually see them, you see your idea of them projecting out into the world and everything you think that means. I mean, you can even think at people of people in your life that you even think of as friends, and you think of the number of times in the last, say, 2 years especially, that you've actually seen them, have actually physically interacted with them, you could probably count them if you had
yeah.
a way to do that or a good memory of doing that. But but then when you think of those different points, those relatively small number of points of times that you've actually connected with that person, and compare it against the construct in your mind of
Mhm.
that person, then those are two very different things. So we build things based on very little points of data. And this is what's, I think, partly wrong with the healthcare system when trying to deal with people with complex mental health needs. They become known as frequent flyers. They
Mm,
become seen as problems, as that they're choosing their behavior,
mm.
that it's a burden on others. And we see this in families too. This is often why parents are sometimes the last people to see that their kid might be suicidal because they're too close. They can't see that kind of awful thing happening to their
Mm.
kids. So there's all sorts of reasons, but I think it all comes back to perspective, the perspective that we're able to take on our own problems and our own life, but also the perspective that others around us are able to take as well.
Yeah, so true, so true. And again, it's why I was excited to talk to you among many reasons because I'm a firm believer. Zooming out from suicide or personal, crises, and that I believe philosophically, certainty is our enemy. Like that's an evil thing, very much for the reason you're saying. Because when you have true certainty, mathematical certainty on something, you do close down all other perspectives. You do buy into all your assumptions that they're absolutely right, and you stop. Your ability to have full clarity goes way down. And it's funny, as you were speaking, I couldn't help but think just yesterday, I was recording a podcast with a friend that I've known for 20 plus years. And we had a conversation much like this about his value. And towards the end of the conversation, I said something like, I'm surprised by the conversation. I didn't know in some ways that you had this much wisdom. And he said, well, maybe you never really looked. And it was very much in line with what you're saying, where I was like, you know what? You're right. I've created this version of what our friendship is and our relationship and who you are. And we just play those parts. And we've done it for 20 years. And it was only when we forced ourselves to look from a different perspective that we learned new things about each other. So I think there's so much truth to that. That's
Mm-hmm.
true for the individual, for society, philosophically, that having that openness, that patience and openness and humility to say maybe it's different than I think it is just unbelievably important.